Walking through Clemson University's beautiful campus that so many call home, you would never expect the dark history it holds. It is hard to see the history of this campus through the orange and purple stripes that walk these hills. If it were not for the historical markers that are scattered around campus, people would not inquire about the history of Clemson. But there is a question we need to ask ourselves. What do these markers really mean? And what are they saying about this campus and the history it has? These markers are more than just markers. They are the beginning of sharing Clemson's full history that lies under this beautiful university. The history of Clemson is not necessarily a comfortable, easy one, but it is something that needs to be discussed. As I dig deeper into the past, I can see a stark difference in what Clemson is now to what it used to be and look like. After reading and discovering more about the history of these markers written in articles on Clemson University's website, they paint a very different picture than the historical plaques do. When I came upon the historical marker of the Fort Hill Slave and Convict Cemetery, I was surprised to hear the unpersonal and inferior tone that emanated from it. The marker was broad in its acknowledgments of the slaves who died and vaguely mentioned that African Americans were buried here. Unlike the front-facing side of the marker, the Woodland Cemetery, which was specific and more personal, mentioning that the first individual who was buried here was a child named John C. Calhoun. To me, it seemed as though not much thought or consideration was put into the making of the Fort Hill plaque, but that the marker that mentioned the white individual was intentionally thought through. This quote was taken from an article written by Kathy Sams on the Clemson University website, and it says, "Each of the new marker is dual-sided, telling more than one story. The physical placements were carefully selected for historical accuracy, maximum visibility, and good storytelling." It was surprising hearing this be their purpose behind these plaques, because to me, they do not accomplish this. There is so much more to the stories of the lives represented on these markers, and a plaque with 2, maybe 3 sentences cannot give the story the credit it deserves. I believe the intentions of putting up these historical markers were pure in wanting to uncover its history, but I feel as though more thought could have been put into the ones concerning the slaves that tirelessly worked for Calhoun. The language used on the 2 sides of the sign is very different. One exudes a tone of empathy and sadness for the child and the many prominent Clemson University leaders that are buried here, and the other is a tone of detachment and zero sympathy for the lives lost. The point of these markers, in my opinion, is to bring to light the history of campus and acknowledge the pain the slaves went through to create this university, but the hard truth is that they do not do that. The Fort Hill Slave and Convict Cemetery marker does not elicit much from the observer. Because it is nonspecific, the observer cannot really connect to the lives lost, whereas in contrast to the Woodland marker, you can connect more. When I read the plaques, I do not get a full depiction of the lives lost, and the pathos appeal that should evoke emotion is not present. The markers, especially the Fort Hill Slave and Convict Cemetery, do not bring me to feel much sympathy about the precious lives lost during this hard time. The marker succeeds by telling what type of people were buried here, yet it fails to bring the full truth of the awful actions that took place here. The events that took place on this beloved campus that so many cherish and hold in such a high position are horrifying, and sadly, many people act like they are unaware or even as if these events didn't happen. Instead of hiding away from the hard truth, we must acknowledge what happened here. This is the only way to make sure history does not repeat itself. Throughout these slaves' lives, they have always been treated and viewed as inferior, but they did great work not only for the Calhouns, but also in the founding of Clemson University. Because of their great work for our school, my expectations for the historical marker would have been a more uplifting and appreciative tone displayed on the plaque. With all of this being said, what are we to do with this information? I believe, as Clemson students, it is our job to educate ourselves on the history of the campus we call home and to acknowledge what makes Clemson what it is to this day. It would be ignorant of us to attend this university and not know the history it has. We need to take action in educating others on the history and be involved in the movement to better our campus so we are sure history does not repeat itself.